preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. Welcome to the third in this year's series of Shape of the City evenings. Once again, our format will be a short introduction with slides by our guest tonight, Eric Owen Moss from Los Angeles. Then the screen will disappear. The chairs will magically appear. We'll spend a while in conversation, both about the things you've seen on the screen and some other topics. And then the final segment of the evening, as always, will be your questions. Please, at any point, feel free to jot a question down on an index card and pass it along to an usher who will bring it to the stage. One final housekeeping point. Next week there will be no evening in this series. We reconvene 2 weeks from now with a very special evening. Henry Cobb, a partner in Pei Cobb Freed and a longtime colleague of I.M. Pei and former dean of the Harvard School of Architecture, will be with us to talk about his own work. I'm very pleased that tonight Eric Owen Moss, one of the important architects of a new generation, is here. He is a native of Los Angeles, educated at Berkeley, and then, in a nod to the East Coast, received his architecture degree at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in 1972. For the last 20 years, he has practiced in Los Angeles, taught at SCI-Arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture. His work, which has been described by some critics as being part of the deconstructivist school, by others as emerging from the post-Frank Gehry Southern California school. You will make up your own mind in the next few minutes. Has won numerous awards, including several awards from Progressive Architecture. He now has a solid and growing office of 16, with work in Vienna, Japan, as well as a lot of work in and around Los Angeles. His firm is, as he put it to me a moment ago, has been limping and struggling along, but now has reached the point where we can do some real damage. His work has also reached the apogee of American architecture in another way. It's been published in a monograph by Rizzoli, copies of which will be available to any of you who are interested in the gallery beside the auditorium after this evening's program. Now, please join me in welcoming Eric Owen Moss. Eric? Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Good evening. I hope it's as interesting out here as it was backstage. I guess we'll find out. Just a light but not light anecdote. I'm looking into absolute blackness. Maybe Kafka's out there and I can't see a thing. So it's like talking to myself, which is what I do a bit of anyway. But I was walking with a couple of friends in Midtown today, and we saw emerging out of the traffic and very quickly disappearing was a bus. And on the side of the bus, it said, "You never know." I don't know whether that's a typically prosaic Manhattan bus, but or was just an anomaly in a sea of otherwise nondescript buses. But this may be at least a way into what is perhaps the you never know hypothesis of what architecture might be. These are the steeds of Mars. in case you have been away. And I wanted to get at this. I never know quite how to get into this discussion, and I'm never quite sure where it's going, but I wanted to try to find a way to get at it from outside architecture. And what I like about this is not the NASA rendition, but these pieces, which turn out photographically to be and to behave very differently than the prognosis was for them before they were studied as they were, which for me is an interesting example of what is always our problem, which is trying to describe and to account for and to measure things in order that we understand how they are and what they might come to be, and inevitably being wrong, being incorrect. And I think we're in a position now to look back over the eons and to see all of the guesses and all of the ideologies and all of the hypotheses that have turned out to be incorrect. And seeing that, it makes it extremely difficult to pontificate or to lay down the rule as this is what it is, so that somehow whatever my hypothesis is, it seems always a little tenuous or tentative for me. And I think those qualities are probably important for the architecture. I don't know that that means that the architecture in the end is equivocal, because there is also in this misshapen, raucous, misbehaving stuff an enormous power, I think, and beauty, if it's still possible, and I'm sure it will be again at some point, to use the word beauty. The shapes were a surprise. For long periods of time, these bodies flying around, these rocks flying around in the sky, including the one we're on, were supposed to be spherical, of course. Orbits were supposed to be circular and all of that. That turns out, of course, not to be true. At a certain point, everything was supposed to move one way. That was the right way. It turns out Phobos, rightly named, moves in the opposite way. It moves retrograde, which means it moves, in the description of the Caltech scientists, it moves the wrong way, presuming there is a right way. So maybe that makes the point. If it doesn't, this might. Astronomy being an avocation. On your right is a building called the Caracol, which is in Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. I started to get interested in the last few years in sources for buildings that run outside of what is really the conventional lineage of history in Western architecture. Because I don't want this to sound like some kind of politically correct discussion. I don't have so much sympathy for that, or multicultural something or other. But there are, in fact, substantial pieces of work on the planet which are not part of the sequence that we are usually handed as constituting the essence of architecture or the evolution of architecture. This is a building that sits outside of that. It also represents, for me, something extremely important but clearly missing in our world, which is a connection of subject and object. The building, apparently, this is Venus, in case you had trouble with the first two. I'm sure you'll have trouble with this one. But apparently, from what anyone can tell, or everyone can tell, the Caracol was designed to chase Venus in the sky. And apparently there was some collective consensus that the building ought to do that and was designed to do that, and everyone understood it and all of that. So there was a kind of apparent coherence, religious, societal, whatever it was, that tied the building, its purpose, its connection to the world, to the cosmos, all of that together in a way that societally, at least at a certain point in time, could be understood. I don't think that's possible or likely now. It probably will be at some point again And because it's not, I think really one source for better and for worse is internal, is introverted, is first of all oneself. Because again, I think it's not possible to make that societal connection. This is really another rendition of the same or a similar kind of discussion. On your left is Angkor Wat, as they probably didn't expect to be seen at the end of the 20th century, and on the right is our patron of Aquinas, Mies van der Rohe at IIT, who probably also didn't expect to be seen covered with vines. The point really has to do again with time eating everything. And I think finally that architecture is for me an attempt to stand against that crushing weight of nihilism, really, looking forward to this and looking backward to that, and trying to find a way to contest what in the end probably can't be contested. That makes it sound very selfish. I don't mean it that way, because I think we all share in that problem, and I think we all share in an attempt at a solution, however in the end feeble those attempts are. On the right is put up there to some extent for fun, and to some extent really to suggest that almost anything is possible. I didn't say good or demanding or rigorous or extraordinary, except that the range of possibilities are probably quite different than the speaker who stood here last week probably suggested. So just to correct whatever assumptions he made, he probably liked the auditorium too. On the left is a slightly modified version of Le Corbusier's drawing that you all know and some love. From Creation is a Patient Search. And I rotated the drawing 90 degrees, a little remodeling of the drawing, in order to position the Apollonian quality sitting on the Dionysian quality. And probably the next step is to Xerox reduce the top half substantially. Because, again, I think my feeling is that whatever is Apollonian or intellectual or cerebral is swimming in a sea which is always bigger than itself. And as hard as you try to equalize them, which is what Le Corbusier did in the drawing, in the end, the bottom swallows the top. On the left, the ubiquitous machine. I think what interests me is probably more the machine at the level of the helicopters that Jimmy Carter sent out that didn't take off because of the sand in the propellers. So that it clearly is an enormous piece of our lives and an aspect of our lives. And I have this line. I've said this a few times. I think this is from Of Time in the River by Thomas Wolfe, not your Thomas Wolfe, but the real Thomas Wolfe, who referred to what he called. He lived down by NYU apparently for a while. The beauty of the railroad car. And I think in its oil and its power and its wheels and its grease and its ability to jerk the earth around in a substantial way, so that it's a force in our lives, and to try to use that not in an ideological way, not in a Hong Kong Bank or Lloyd's, not in that kind of way, but for some of its erogenous qualities and even some of its stumble bum qualities, which it has as well. On the right, that's a scale that I use from time to time, but it has really to do in a cartoonish way with the issue of measure and number, and that finally that runs out of gas as well. On your left is, we may have exhausted this astronomy discussion already, but it's a very old Babylonian map of the sky, which of course turns out to be not exactly correct, leaving out any number of things. Notwithstanding the fact that the people who made it thought that it was absolutely correct, but the instinct, again, and I think it's part of our problem, is always to try to explain, to map, to account for a sequence, to do that so that not only do we understand this way, over the shoulder, but so that we can predict. And I think my sense is the New York City bus, that notwithstanding the instinct to predict, you still don't know which bus is coming. On the right is near Kyoto, that's Ise, a shrine, a famous Taoist shrine, which I'm sure most of you know. And I put it in because it's a literal attempt to deal with the question of movement of things in time. And just to refresh your memory, the way it works is, and this goes back to I think to the 7th century when this game was begun. There are two contiguous sites, and the building is built on the first site and continues for 20 years, and then is taken down and rebuilt with new materials on the adjacent site, and 20 years, and then back and forth and so on. So that it literally embodies an idea about change and permanence. It's always vital, it's always fresh, it's always new, it's always moving, and yet it's constant, it's stable, it's consistent, it's predictable. They're cheating, of course. I mean, they could lean on a quality or a sense of experience that I can't, maybe you can. But the quality of that experience, I would think, would be one that architecture could aspire to. I'm going to go through these just so we can give Goldberger his shot. Because I think in a sort of feeble attempt to censor myself, I cut this stuff down, but I don't know if I cut it down enough. This is a project for an opera house and experimental theater in Shibuya, done a few years ago. And just very briefly, and on the right is an attempt to reconstitute a really disingenuous chronology of how the thing was done, how it was put together, and what it meant. Although the experience of the building is quite distinct and quite separate from a hypothesis of legibility and sequence and all of that. So the experience of the building and the attempt to regurgitate it, if you excuse the expression, in a sort of linear way or sequential way, really was, as I said, a bit disingenuous. This is a project for a country club near San Diego, California. One of the aspects which is entered into the work, there's a model on your right, which is an amalgamation of pieces that in fact are known, and known as distinct elements. There's actually a vault and a gable there, although it may be unrecognizable in that rendition. And part of the recent work seems to involve utilizing those, but redefining their meaning as a consequence of the amalgamation, so that in the end it's conceivable that one doesn't know the source at all, although the source of the disparate components, although the source is known to the architect. So in fact, a piece is invented out of known pieces, which leads to an experience in which the sources are not legible. This is a more recent project for the Nara Convention Center in Japan. And actually I don't know if that's focused on the right, this is again a kind of attempt, a linear attempt at mapping, at accounting for a series of pieces and ideas in a sequence which finally, for me, doesn't really represent the experience of the building. It also uses, it began by stealing a quote, and I'll get it wrong, but somebody here will correct me, probably Paul, but from Prospero in The Tempest, it has to do with the globe, the earth, all that it shall inherit will dissolve and leave not a rack behind, which is likely to happen at some point, at least according to global warming theories, may happen pretty quick. So maybe this was done just at the right time. But this started with actually a globe as a source, and very primitive as a symbol, the ball, the earth, but also the ball as the sky. And then there are a series of theaters here, which are in a sense connections or band-aids between the sky and the earth. So it might be a kind of symbolism in different vogue that you could find someday on Easter Island, for instance. And I don't say that facetiously, although I'm not sure I believe it. This is the drawing on the right is called the Dancing Towers. This is part of a project built in Los Angeles about 4 years ago. The plan is, I think, the intellectual side of these buildings. The section is the more ethereal side, so that certain issues or ideas in a cerebral way, in a chronology way, are readable in plan, but when they're transferred to space, become lost. The drawing also ought to suggest a sense of the building as moving, like the issue of time. That things aren't constant and they're not stable, so that there are any number of ways that this can be seen and can be understood. Little of the railroad car there on the left, in case you missed it. This is a project also in Los Angeles, which is an intervention in an existing a concrete building, which is to some extent an attack on Euclid, but a utilization of Euclid. There's illustrated in the drawing on the left what amounts to a theoretical both vault and cylinder, which is adjusted in a way so that the edge becomes parabolic. There also, I think you can see that in the slide on the right. So it's a vault becomes something other than a vault. It sits on its own structure, which penetrates the original building through the original roof. The column, the bent column or displaced column that you see in the slide on the right, I think starts to suggest, and this is part of a complex of buildings, complex as in grouping, not in a psychoanalytic sense, which is the displaced column and finally the displaced wall and displaced roof, and might lead us in the end to a kind of displaced city or a hypothesis of the displaced city. These are drawings showing the intervention of that piece from the roof, penetrating the building. It sits on these clay legs, forms a kind of internal proscenium. And this is the bridge. This is a project at the University of California at Irvine, which actually does make some attempt to connect with a prevailing order on the campus, although to hide simultaneously the attempt at connection. It's a radial campus, or originally radially organized. The original scheme for the building actually used an ellipse to take possession of the site, to control the site, and then the ellipse is adjusted against the site, which itself slopes, and the axis of the ellipse references the center of the campus. This is another building in that grouping of buildings in Los Angeles. This particular piece, this wall, is to some extent, I think, a questioning of all walls. It leans. It may also suggest issues of balance and structure in terms of order, structure in terms of support. It's typically seen on end, which is this way. That happens to be a clock, which for the moment doesn't work, but that may be okay because in the end, no clocks work. You guys like that, huh? Around the corner from the unworking clock, the west-facing wall of the building, which may to some extent deal with what I call the issue of the railroad car. There are pieces that have a utilitarian exegesis here, but you can't tell those from the pieces that don't. I can, but you can't. In the center of the first interior block of this building is a court which hypothetically has a double gabled cruciform roof, whatever that is. But we won't get into that except to say that this piece falls, this fountain falls or designates the center of that, and that roof then spreads out over the adjoining offices and appears and disappears depending on the significance of the particular office and its occupant in the hierarchy, such as it is, of this particular company. There's also a conference room. This is looking up. The other is looking down in case one is not inclined to look straight ahead, which is probably the conventional way people behave in a conference room. There's a more normative conference room. This really adjoins the head man's office and is a chance for him to stretch his range a little bit, which he has yet to do as far as I can tell. But anyway, he's not here, so I don't think. If he is, I deny it all. And looking into that room laterally. And the projection of the piece through the roof. This is a project which is about to start construction. It's about the length of a soccer field, about 100 meters, and it's disposed in the air, kind of air rights project, over a road with some existing buildings underneath it, which have to continue to operate in a conventional loading, unloading, light industrial way. And therefore the legs or the structure of the building are arranged or arrayed in what apparently is, at least not in a conventional sense, a logical manner of support, but which in fact has the logic given to it by the buildings underneath it, which will long be removed by the time the building above is removed. So what starts out as an initial logic, in the end, what precipitated it will be gone, and the building will simply be the building. There are two critical points in it. One, it's essentially a block, one at the entrance to the block, which is shown in the drawing there, and the other one at a point about 3/4 of the way down. Both have to do with entrance, exiting, all of that. This is drawing on the left is a suggestion of the arrangement of the columns relative to loading doors and so on. In a more conventional utilitarian sense, this is the way the thing works: trucks in, trucks out, and those two key points are coincident with the entry and exit points, and model from the front on the right. This is actually several projects in one. A very big piece over a railroad track which sort of serpentines around the perimeter of that aerial photo on the right, which we're now working on, which is called Sparsity for Southern Pacific Air Rights City, an abandoned railroad track. And there are a series of computer drawings that were done in order to terrorize the local planning department, which apparently has been successful. Thing's still alive. And within that, I don't know whether the lights are out or my eyes are down, but within that is another project of substantial scale, which includes 3 small theaters for the Mark Taper, some office space, a parking garage, et cetera, over somewhere in that part of the room. And here, the first step in the sequence, I said there were 3, one on the right is 2, the previous slides were the third. This is the first, which is a reconstituted, reconfigured, remodeled piece of about 60,000 square feet, which runs as an L-shaped plan entered there on the right, slide on the left, and then moving vertically, and then moving horizontally. And I'll show you a couple of slides of that. Study model on the left, the entrance to the piece on the right. Again, the entrance detail. Drawing meant to illustrate if you don't like it, you can go the other way. But you'll like it. Looking up before going in, probably always a safe behavior pattern. And then down the nave here on the left, not spelled with a K. One of the Ark of the Covenant here, one of the tenant spaces. This is a space of about 5,000 square feet for a consumer research affairs company, perverting the use of psychology to sell Coca-Cola, among other things. This is the inside on the left, the inside of the previous slide, and how it infects this piece, which is infectious or contagious, but I don't think I mean that in a pejorative way, and runs into and affects what otherwise would be fairly straightforward rooms that adjoin it. The next space is the Los Angeles answer to the Champs-Élysées, which is this series of steel frames that has little to do with the Arc de Triomphe, but runs, I don't want to help Goldberger with cartoons of Los Angeles, but runs to an exercise room, which is that triangulated piece at the top of the slide on the left. Drawn on the left, and the split section axonometric on the right, showing this series of frames, which is monochromatic and homogeneous and consistent and regular and predictable, and all of the opposites of that simultaneously as one works one's way down that axis, which is shown off-center on the left. And detail here. And the ubiquitous exercise room. An adjacent space for a filmmaker, which for me, this is the key space in that tenant's area. Which I've always referred to as a street corner, because it actually is the area that it has no utility except as a way of passing through and hanging out on the way to things which are more or less drudgery, if you believe the people who work for this guy. So this is the respite in that sequence, this internal space. And the last room in this sequence is a conference room with a table that I designed, shown in detail on the left. Maybe we can hold the Last Supper here if it shows up again. This is a house which has been under construction for about a year, and to some extent is an extension of the street corner idea, the major space, which is the piece in the model at the back, being a kind of a societal gathering space for the building, which is nominally related to the act of cooking and eating. This is in West Los Angeles, and that space under construction there on the left. Again, there's a very clear series of plan drawings which designate pieces in the building, but which are intelligible only if one looks at the plan. So again, there's something underneath it, but what's underneath it is never clear or never totally clear. You probably have to dig if you want to find it, and it probably is not possible to discover altogether. This is a recent project, a house in a place called Tarzana, for reasons left to you. It's a suburb of Los Angeles, and it sits on the edge of a hill overlooking what's called the Santa Monica Conservancy, an area which can't be built on for the next several hundred years at least. And I think, again, this project has to do with balance and movement and the attempt to stabilize that movement, but not in an emotional sense to prevent the possibility that it would be felt. Although, of course, if it literally happens, we have different problems. This is a project for a theater in Vienna, which is, I think, about the ethereal properties of weight and steel. Actually, it joins a canal, and one can connect through the theater platform to a road below. And just to reiterate my sense that it all keeps moving, quite literally at Abu Simbel, one step ahead of the S1 dam, which is really a kind of astonishing photograph. I mean, I like it a lot. When you think about what appears to be the durability of that civilization, and quite literally, it's not immune to being moved around. I think by implication, that's my job as well, and architecture's job, not necessarily to make things better or worse, but to keep them alive and moving. I think architecture has to do that. Thanks very much.
To keep things moving here, let me ask a general question as a starter. There seems to be a conflict in, perhaps an intentional conflict, in the extent to which your work seems to strive to derive from order and yet express chaos. Is that a fair statement, or is it an unfair statement? All right.
In the first place, chaos is a very easy word at this point.
Right.
And I don't, if one could deliver chaos, I think one has already destroyed the possibility by trying to define it and delimit it. I think there are qualities in the buildings which are intentionally difficult to read, and the experience ought to be that they're difficult to read. And the feeling which precedes the intellectualization ought to be, to some extent, disconcerting. But it's disconcerting to walk out the front door and look at the sky. If you're in what I call this sort of problem of nihilism, and I'm sure as hell not the first person to talk about that, but if you feel that and you want to try to build it into the work, you have to control it. I mean, you have to know how to manage it. You can't pile up stuff, as in
Sure.
the slide. The last,
Sure,
and
sure.
chaos is maybe not the word.
Well, is it an intentional desire to confront nihilism by coming to the brink almost, and then holding back, by staring it in the face in a way?
Well, I think the act of doing anything in an artistic sense, painted, written, drawn, built, is a stand against nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
It stands against it, because in the end, if you said it's all impossible,
Right.
eons this way, eons that way,
Then
off the bridge.
Well, then why get up in the morning at all if that's
Yeah,
the view?
and well, but there are people who have felt that very
Sure.
deeply, who came to that conclusion and decided not to get up. I mean, I don't know quite how to deliver that. I don't mean in a sentimental way
Right.
or
No, I
in a
know.
melodramatic way. So I think the act of doing these kinds of things, or of writing, is a stand against it, almost ipso facto.
Sure.
Whether it was the guy last week or the guy this week or the guy next week, in the end. I mean, there's more similarity than apparent dissimilarity, although the dissimilarities would be fought over.
Sure.
But the act of doing it is the most important thing. So when you act, you're saying, okay, I'll push the rock.
Mm-hmm.
I decided to push the rock.
You mentioned the guy last week, so let me follow up on that. He seemed to see, this is Robert Stern, for those of you who may not have been here last week, the act of making architecture as the act of making comfort. You seem to see it as the act of making challenge. in a way.
I wouldn't say it's challenge, but
okay.
anybody who is alive can't be comfortable. I mean, not possible. So it's pretentious to say that this is about making comfort. This is like the Prince of Wales stuff, you know? And this is not what it means to be alive. So, I mean, this is like Estee Lauder, you know, putting on makeup or something. I mean, it's artificial. I mean, you can cheer for comfort if you want to. I mean, that, I guess you have to understand comfort and discomfort, and in the end, you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Maybe that's the answer.
Well, can we, in fact, literally be comfortable being uncomfortable, say, in one of your houses?
Well, there are places to hide in the house. I mean, I think the house actually, the couple is actually in that last house is slightly schizophrenic, actually. And if they weren't before, they are now.
Right.
Hope there aren't any clients here. But I think that it's not a matter of depositing someone in a world in which they can't operate. I think it's a matter of stretching out the range of experience, what's possible, how it's possible to understand or to try to understand. Those people are art collectors, a big art collector, so if all else fails, they can cover the thing up with paintings, and they're probably damn near in a position to do that.
Can one actually hang paintings successfully in those spaces?
Yeah, I think so. It's actually been studied very carefully. The lighting, the wall. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I mean, you are, for all we may talk of nihilism, it seems, I sense a very deep commitment to the visceral experience of being in space, the emotional component of feeling a particular space. And in that sense, that actually may tie you more closely than you would want to admit to the guy last week, as we call him.
Yeah. I think some of those spaces, I mean, every once in a while you hit something which works. That probably happens rarely in almost any human activity. But there are a couple of those which I think actually pick you up.
That conference room actually looked quite remarkable.
And deposits you somewhere else. And I think that experience actually may get you out of what I'm talking about when I say nihilism. I don't know, maybe it's too late even to talk about nihilism because it's been talked about by a lot of interesting and intelligent people, and now we got a film called Kafka, which I haven't. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it, no.
Yeah. I don't know, my daughter liked it. I think it had to do with somebody running around and behaving very strangely.
Right. Well, it was sort of a tried to merge Kafka's fiction with a biography of him, and sort of.
Yeah, which I'm sure would embarrass the hell out of him.
Yeah.
You know.
Right.
So maybe the subject is better implicit than explicit.
It's interesting, the comparison between your work and Kafka. Actually, I find sort of intriguing. Speaking of Kafka, is a perfect way into Philip Johnson, who
That'll be news.
referred to you in the preface he wrote to your new monograph as a jeweler of junk. So I thought was a rather nice turn of phrase. But it also suggested that what he was perceiving more than the sort of the deconstructivist issues that we've been talking around was a connection that I think he also pointed out, as I recall, to the work of Carlos Scarpa and the concern for materials, the sensual quality of materials that's quite apparent in your work.
Well, I'd like to say something about the deconstruction discussion.
Sure.
I think Johnson didn't completely miss it, but he came close.
Right.
For me, and I tried to get him to change the thing, and I wasn't able to do it in the tradition of the First Amendment. But I think my first interest has really to do with the making of the object and the making of the space. And there are other issues that then, as big things are inevitably assembled from little things, that there are questions of assembly and detail and the erogenous railroad car discussion. And I think what he did, and I would assume anyone would be flattered with an association with Scarpa, but the making of those pieces is, I think, not primary. I think it's, I don't know if it's secondary or tertiary, but for me, it doesn't account for the impetus to the work. But it's something you can grab onto more readily. So if you don't want to deal with this, you can deal with this.
Right.
So I'm saying he missed this and he dealt with this.
Right. So you don't really consider him a central source for you, or an essential. I don't know.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Central source?
I mean,
Like Kafka.
no, I didn't mean like
I just
Kafka.
consider him a friend, that's all.
Okay. No. I'm sorry. I didn't mean Johnson.
Sure.
I meant I was back to Scarpa again.
Oh. Then I don't know the work so well. I mean,
Okay.
I have the books, and I would assume those kinds of things rub off. I don't think they're intents to pilfer or steal or use in a literal way, but there are probably some of those connections. He's certainly an architect, an admirable architect.
I was fascinated by one other juxtaposition of words that you had earlier, which was erogenous and stumblebum or something like that. I mean, the idea of a kind of deep sensuousness and powerful emotional component, and yet a certain desire to reflect a helter-skelter world as well, or set of forms.
I think one of the problems with this is if you decide to talk about these things, that you have to find a way to talk.
Right.
And I think the one aspect of the book which I considered quite successful, which was done on tape, was somehow an effort to get into the language of the text. This sense, I mean, it's the way I talk, or I've learned to talk, or tried to learn how to talk, so that it doesn't sound like you're walking around with the unabridged Webster, you know.
I don't think anyone would accuse you of that.
I don't know, Frampton or somebody. But on the other hand, there's a polemic, and there's an idea, and there are very deep feelings, which one is trying to convey somehow outside the sort of conventional lexicon of discussion, both in building and in talking about the buildings, and an effort to try to find a way to do that. And I think that's where those words come from.
Okay. Your observation early on when you showed us those opening images in misshapen and raucous stuff is a great beauty.
Yeah.
Struck me as also possibly a comment on Los Angeles and on your view of it, or it could be. It's the first time Mars has ever been thought of as a metaphor for L.A.
Well, that's your association.
It struck me as an appropriate one. No,
it would.
Okay.
It doesn't. I mean,
Doesn't
it strikes me. Well, I don't want to perpetuate, although it's fun to make fun of the sort of New Yorker's cartoon of L.A. or the L.A.'s cartoon of Manhattan. I mean, the L.A. cartoon, which we talked about for 2 minutes, is the Nouvelle Cuisine,
sure.
gun-toting on the freeway,
right.
or something.
Although why is referring to something as misshapen and raucous but possessing great beauty the same as the gun-toting freeway guy? Yeah.
No, I'm saying it's not. You're asking me if there's an association between an image of L.A. I'm saying there isn't.
Okay.
I think has some appeal as an experience. That slide, that photograph, and that disorder of order, because it's actually astonishing not only what those things look like, but it's a surprise that they don't look like what they were supposed to look like, nor do they behave the way they were predicted to behave. So there are any number of lessons in that. And that, for me, was a lesson which exists outside of Los Angeles, has nothing to do with Los Angeles.
Okay, good. Let me move to some of these questions, because there are a lot of interesting ones. And I'll start with a very general one. Why does architecture have to keep things alive and moving?
It doesn't. I mean, I think there are any number of people who wouldn't insist on that. And I think in true New Yorker and egalitarian spirit, I think I said there are any number of perceptions, some closer to correct and some closer to incorrect. For me, what I think I'm interested in doing is communicating an experience of living in this time, which I feel can be shared. If you feel that, and I think as time passes and I make a few connections in the profession to people who are not in Los Angeles, but other people around the world who see the work, I think they start to understand that and share in that, as well as people, most of whom are outside of architecture, who might also share that feeling. So I think it's a valid sense of what it means to be alive now. There are probably, I don't see how you can live without that feeling in you somewhere. There might be the sort of medieval cobbler on the corner, Mr. Creer's version, or Sanitize It, or the Prince of Wales or something, where you say, but I don't want to face that, or I don't want to deal with that. But it seems to me that ought to be part of our generation speaking, looking that way, and to people who will come in the future, so that they understand what we understood.
Good. If you look at the tilted window, column, etc., without understanding the reasons, we might say that they're decorative. If that's the case, then what's the difference between your work and Venturi or Graves?
I'm not sure I want to speak for Venturi or Graves, and I'm not sure who we is, and I'm not sure what decorative means. So to try to unravel that question is actually difficult without a few definitions. But I think for me, decorative has a pejorative connotation, and for Venturi, it
does not.
It's an asset.
That's correct.
It's not a liability, and I think so. Decorative would be the antithesis of an inclination to dig, or to inquire, or to unravel, even if you knew in the end that it can't be unraveled. So you have to try. So if a wall does something which walls don't do, then by implication you've raised the question of what's a wall. You may have raised other questions by implication to people who are not particularly interested in or taken by building.
Yep.
So that there are other things that probably or properly could be questioned. So the idea of trying to get underneath, I think, is what it means to make those kinds of adjustments and to see when is a wall, and a column, and a city. And that may be architecture's way, or a way in architecture, of raising those issues, rather than to pretend that they were smooth and that the surface of the water is unperturbed. It's perturbed.
I think what that questioner was actually getting at was the column can have a different meaning to somebody who, one doesn't necessarily automatically read it as representing the question that you raise. And two, the casual observer who doesn't pick up on the deeper question, it could then appear to be decorative, and therefore what do we do about that?
Not a damn thing. I mean, I think that the deconstruction question that you raised, whatever its roots in, for instance, Damon and people like that, and I think their translation into architecture is embarrassing to the architects who tried to steal from people who were at that level a little more sophisticated. But if there's an argument that somehow the reading of things both belongs to the writer and to the reader, let's say that's somehow part of this discussion, but not exclusively to the reader, then if someone wants to understand differently, then no one can rule that out. And it may be that in all discussions, including this one, that nobody is quite hearing what anybody is saying. And therefore, whatever you're saying to me is filtered through, and whatever I'm saying, and the column as well. So that if the reading of the column is something other than this is about digging, then maybe the fact that it has those other, I don't know, proclivities, or could suggest something at some level that might be funny, not necessarily Roll in the Aisles funny, but maybe King Lear's Fool funny. That would be okay with me. I think that would be all right.
Do you want your architecture to have a tragic dimension? Do you think it can? Is it too much to ask?
The problem, I don't want to sort of pick at all the words, but I think that you got to be careful with that, otherwise you start to sound melodramatic. And that embarrasses everybody, or it embarrasses me. I think that whether you want to say that the circumstance is tragic, the sort of nihilism business, from the point of view of an individual human being who looks into never, it probably is tough. Whether that constitutes tragedy, I don't know.
All right. Tragedy is not melodrama, though. I mean, in fact, they are very different things, as you know. Now, if every wall questions the meaning of the wall, don't we begin to get inured to the whole thing after a while? I mean, if we see too many of your walls questioning wallness, do they continue? Do they continue to have the impact that they're designed to do? I mean, do they not have what impact they have largely because other walls do not question wallness, but when they become common, in much the same way that Mises Seagram building was so much more powerful when it stood on Park Avenue surrounded by older masonry buildings of a very different aesthetic. And
it's not hard to find still, though.
No, it's not hard to find, but
as an experience, I don't mean as an address.
Right. True. But I think there was a certain level of experience that was reduced when the tension between it and what was around it evaporated.
Well,
maybe that's not the right analogy to your work. Okay.
In the first place, that wall, which behaves differently than other walls, is one wall in a group of quite a number in that building. I don't think there's any particular danger in that city as a whole of everyone running around now and building those walls,
right?
And the issue of that wall being buried. But I think you hit on one point which is always of interest and of importance in these discussions, that certain things exist in opposition to other kinds of things.
Precisely.
And gain their meaning as a consequence of that opposition. I think that's true in architecture. It's true in other forms of protest.
In politics, sure.
Maybe. I mean, that's a different one. But because I don't know where you find the substance in that discussion.
We don't have to try. It's all right.
Right. So I think what I'm saying is you're absolutely right that the opposition between one piece and another galvanizes an experience which I can't see as being lost as the city around it changes. The experience may change, but the buildings that come to surround those buildings, I think, won't be this building. There'll be other buildings. The other implication of the point may be how long can you pay attention before you switch the channel. But that may be a problem for us and not for the building. That is, what is your attention span is the question. And my assumption is that at least for one or two people, it'll be more than a couple of seconds. And if it isn't, then they have to go somewhere else.
If it's a house, it's got to be quite a bit more than a couple of seconds.
Well, but the house will certainly outlast the inhabitants by quite a long period of time. I think what you seem to be saying is that these things were sort of ethereal or ephemeral.
No, I'm not saying the things are ephemeral. I'm saying that their impact can be ephemeral. Not the things themselves.
Is that a critique of the building or a critique of the person who comes to see it?
Well, now you've taken the stance of the artist who says that the person who does not, if the person does not appreciate my work sufficiently, the fault is clearly in them and not in the work. You're not the first to have taken such a stance. It's okay, but I think that's the position you're taking by that remark.
The act of doing the building is to some extent a call to pay attention to things that aren't ordinarily attended to.
Absolutely.
Ergo, ergo there is a group out there who's not paying attention, so you're probably right. They'll continue in many ways not to pay attention. So in the end, the building may be for three people, two of whom aren't born yet.
Okay.
And you're the third.
But let's take even the most conscientious, sympathetic, understanding and intellectually alive client, can even that ideal person continue to pay attention day in, day out if he or she is living in one of your houses?
I'm not sure what you're asking for. I mean,
what I'm
life
asking
is about
here
a lot of things,
right,
not
right.
only inhabiting
Right.
buildings.
Right.
So,
But when one does inhabit one of your houses, can one become numb to the things that the house is intended to be about by living in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or whatever? I mean, if the reason for being of the house is to send a certain sort of clarion call almost through our conscience or through our consciousness, can we survive that level of intensity of input, of message, of challenge, of whatever we want to call it, as a constant diet?
Yeah, that's interesting. In my experience of almost everything is that your sense of pain or joy or focus moves.
Yes. Right.
And that if you feel something, or even if you believe something, or you experience something, that it goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to run and go get it.
Right.
And find it again. And reconstitute it again. And look for it.
Yeah,
and find it and lose it. And I think in the buildings, as in living, they should in the end be the same. I don't think that the buildings are overbearing.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are ways of escaping. If nothing else, everybody sort of goes out the door in the morning and does other things. So it may be an opportunity actually to return at least to a different confrontation than the one that takes place downtown or something.
Right.
So.
Okay. Let me return to a couple of these. Here's a somewhat more conventional question. How do you find contractors who will build the things you've designed? And how do you write specs for what you want? Do you use the C51 three-part format? We don't need to get that technical.
Actually, the question is sort of cynical question, if it's interesting at all. And I think the presumption is that nobody can do anything, or it used to be better in the old days or something. There are certainly people, in my experience, we'll find out now as we get to a slightly larger scale, but there are a number of people, you don't need thousands, that are interested in doing work in a certain way, that take a certain amount of joy and a certain amount of pride in doing work in a certain way, and notwithstanding what the Japanese Prime Minister seems to think. And that's a part of the American workforce. And so it's available. And we write specs in the most conventional way, and then we throw in a few poems and do a little coaching, and that's it.
And it gets built. Please comment about your contextual baseball stadium as seen in the Babe Ruth Museum. Is that?
I'm not sure. We did a project a number of years ago, which was a proposal for a stadium in San Francisco. That's the only one I know, and it's published in sort of popular It was done for a magazine actually called California Magazine.
Right.
If that's what you're talking about.
I don't know. The questioner also asked about Camden Yards in Baltimore. Maybe has you confused with somebody else. But tell us about the San Francisco one then.
Okay. The discussion I think we don't want to turn this into a discussion of athletics in America, but the proposition, I don't think the proposition was that old stadia, like at the Fenway, for instance, which had to conform to the irregularities of the city, were, as an experience of sport, more appealing and endearing than were the sort of conventional engineered and so on and so on in Pittsburgh, in Kansas City, in Dallas, wherever they are. And therefore, the proposal in San Francisco actually had to do with a site south of Market Street, where the stadium that I proposed was to be cut into a site, but in an irregular way, utilizing some existing buildings, configuring the stadium so that it had to modify itself, and then proposing a number of new buildings and wrapping these pieces all together with a kind of new organizational and circulatory ordering of the entire area, so that the stadium would galvanize all of that and everybody would go off into the sunset holding hands. So it was a kind of act of societal optimism as well as design, but unfortunately didn't get funded, and I think they're now moving to San Jose.
Yeah, I think that's right. On the issue of time, standing in the baptistry in Pisa and looking towards the Duomo and the Leaning Tower, I was moved to tears by their beauty and whimsy. Do you think that the architecture we produce in our age is bound to move anyone to tears 800 years from now, assuming that our shabby buildings will survive?
Spoken like a true New Yorker. I mean, I can probably, I mean, the implication is clearly the answer is no, at least given the tone of the question. It may, I mean, to tie it into some Italianate machinations, probably misunderstands everything. I mean, I don't know anybody who is doing Pisa, even people who are advocates of it. The experience of living is in many ways different, probably in some ways similar. I'm not sure what's the same and what's different, but clearly there are differences. So what we would deliver to the next group 800 years from now would have to be about a different kind of problem, or a different kind of difficulty, or a different kind of joy, or a different kind of pain. And whether the ultimate human experience of architecture is being moved to tears, I don't know. There are all sorts of experiences that have to do with the power, kind of emotive power of building, which may include this sense of literally lifting someone and depositing him somewhere else, might include fright or apprehension, or some of the issues of stability and instability that I talked about. And I think some of those you can only pass along what you can pass along. You can't pass along what you can't pass along. So if you like what you were talking about, I think you have to go to Pisa.
From Pisa to Barcelona. This next questioner says, your work makes me think of Gaudí. Is his work a source for you?
He got hit by a trolley car.
We didn't ask if his life was a source for you, only whether his work was a source for you.
Yeah, but I think I answered in the way that I think as a sort of, as an act of living, in terms of what he did and the diligence with which he did it and pursued it over substantial periods of time, I think in some cases with a lot of support, in some cases with something of the opposite. I think as a model for doing any or pursuing anything, he's certainly a model. In a literal sense, I think he's probably interesting because his work is such an anomaly, and yet now, after a long period of time, it seems to connect strangely with the experiences of very many people, which may say that what is an apparent anomaly at one point in time may actually be a connector among people at another point in time. So I think in that sense, he's certainly an inspiration.
Good. You know, in a way, that is a stronger answer to the previous question you gave before, the Pisa question, I think. Your drawings are unique representations themselves. What is the central message that they are conveying about the specifics of your spaces?
Actually, these drawings, most of these drawings are not my drawings. I didn't show any of my drawings, although I work on these, but there are a number of other people who work on them as well, and that should probably be said. I think if there's a message or the intent, I think the intent belongs to me. The hand doesn't always belong to me. In a number of these drawings is perhaps to describe aspects of the process of doing buildings which are not amenable to someone who would visit the building. So it's a way of getting at a more cerebral side. It's a way of a kind of exegesis of qualities of thought which are not typically part of the experience of being in the building.
Okay. The current Architectural Digest writes about an artist's house, designed and apparently built by the artist himself, based on an inspiration from Frank Gehry. Can architects do the reverse and paint and/or sculpt based on inspirations from Akia and/or Christo?
Who was the last one? Krista?
Christo. Or I guess it could be really any artist. The point is not those specific artists, I suppose.
I mean, is the question whether an architect can be inspired to do a painting by an artist?
That seems to be the question, but take it any way you want.
Yeah. I mean, I think architects, like anyone else, can be inspired by any number of things.
Sure.
Architects have license to paint whatever the hell they want. They
Right.
can paint whatever they want, inspired by whoever they like. But I would assume, I mean, the ground between painting and architecture is, let's put it another way. The issue of making the building is substantial enough so that I'm not sure that the architect has the need to go to a different discipline or a different adventure, but can work those inspirations out in the building.
Right, okay.
There was a guy who used to do that at the poetry level and write poems to bricks and so on. And they probably should have stuck to architecture.
You mean,
be careful.
do you mean Con or?
C-O-N?
I mean, what was that?
I was just correcting the spell. No,
okay.
I mean, it had to do with I was never particularly a fan of the poetry. And he's entitled to do whatever he wants. I think I was saying stick to architecture.
Right. Well, I mean, we can say that of Korb and his both writings and art as well, can we not?
We could. I think the writings are actually, some of the writings
Some of them are
very moving.
Yeah.
And I think a little different than Kahn's poetry.
Right. Since a late entrant here. Okay, thank you.
That's the "Are you kidding?"
Right. Since LA architects are being trained to inspect earthquake-damaged buildings, if I'm ever sent to inspect one of yours, I'll tell them it looks fine, but the original architect should be called in.
Fine.
Okay, leave it at that. All right. Do you feel your projects are a dichotomy between buildings and the urban fabric? If not, how do they work within context, either typologically or ideologically?
My sense of the context discussion is that whatever is the context, it's not that street, that neighborhood, and probably not that city. I heard somebody say just a few minutes ago that there were big pieces of Los Angeles that were flooded, and it didn't make a hell of a lot of difference because there were actually many more that were essentially the same. And the human problem aside, that or get off the freeway. Oh, I got off at the wrong off-ramp, but it didn't matter. I don't think that context, if you want to call it that, the physiology of that context is particularly vibrant or moving or encouraging. It's not really something you can push off against. I think it doesn't galvanize you. If you push on it, it falls down. So if not literally, then figuratively. There may be another context which I think I would appeal to, which has to do with the experience of a number of people now who are interested or who might be interested, who might live in a variety of places all over the planet. So that to some extent the discussion is a discussion with them or with others who might find it useful at some point in time. In terms of ideology, if it's an ideology which is apprehensive about ideology or suspicious of ideology, and I think suspicious of itself. So it probably, like any megalomaniac, so you have to be suspicious of everyone, including yourself, there's probably a desire to pontificate or to say this is the way it is, but simultaneously the realization of the danger in that, in general terms, and which are probably more dangerous than in architectural terms. So I don't think there's a political ideology. There may be an experiential sense that life is personal. It's not interchangeable. You have to do this one at a time, and it doesn't have a kind of collective societal hope that it would move any group anywhere in any way. But maybe people as individuals finally could get some, could learn from it.
Well, you're arguing, in effect, against what we might call physical contextualism, and in favor of a kind of contextualism of time and moral imperative and certain other issues that you see yourself as part of a kind of conceptual context as opposed to a physical or geographical context.
I think, I mean, that's the experience of living in the world at this point. I mean, everybody here goes out and goes to JFK and goes every place, and I mean, it all moves.
Right.
And one of the reasons I said, here's the dancing towers, and they move. That the experience is not this kind of homogeneous, static, stable. It's just not.
Sure.
And so.
And yet there's an enormous sort of counteracting cultural imperative to try to reverse the tendency toward homogeneity around the world and build in a more site-specific or regional way, which is something.
But that has to do with using shingles. If you're next to a building made out of shingles, I mean, maybe. I mean, because I mean, you have to be careful with things that belong to regions. Otherwise, you got Yugoslavia or something in an architectural sense. In a parochial sense, you know, mine is this and yours is that. And I think at this point, it may go back to that at some point in time. Maybe we're heading in that direction. But that makes me uncomfortable in a way which I would like to try to resist. So if we could spread it out instead of hold.
Do you feel it's too sentimental or too easy, too soft?
Yeah, too convenient.
Too convenient.
Yeah, and the precedent is there, and therefore you don't have to kick the precedent. You just swallow it whole.
Right.
And I think you can't swallow anything whole. I mean, there are some things you just have to regurgitate.
Okay, good. We're getting close to our adjournment time, but we have time for a couple more, I think. This is about the persistent use of the ellipse the questioner puts it in quotes, in the intellectual plan and in the ephemeral section. You comment on the use of the ellipse?
Sure. I think I didn't show any of the current work. I think it, for the moment, has passed into nirvana or something. I mean, I'm less interested in it now. I think my original interest had to do with its order. You can write an equation for it, but it's not a circle. It's more quizzical than a circle. It has maybe one center in a certain way. It has two centers in another way. It has three centers in another way. So it might be a better object for Carl Jung than a circle. And I think those properties, for instance, the ellipse, which is built in that warehouse remodel,
Right.
When you make it, when it's made physically, it's actually made out of blocks, which are, of course, rectilinear, which is another kind of contradiction. And as the blocks move around the perimeter, their relationship to each other changes as the curve goes from shallower to steeper. So you read the kind of evolution and devolution, if there's such a word, of the piece as it goes around. So I think it has a number of fascinating properties that can be exploited physically, but also as a conceptual idea. It's never delivered whole. I mean, it's never delivered as an entity. It might exist as a premise, but when it shows up in the building, there are always only pieces of it. And in the conference room that you mentioned, it's actually conical, which is in principle impossible, because you can't have a conical ellipse. It never resolves itself. So that may be a subject for Freud, although it doesn't have to resolve itself the way it's designed. So it's mixed with other issues, I think, in almost every case.
Good. Let's conclude with this one. In an appropriate format, where is the answer to some possible peace in this life? You have jumped on your fears and have run in all directions.
I wish I could run in all directions.
Can you bring that question back to architecture somehow?
I don't know why somebody would ask me a question like that. I have no idea. Where's the... read it again.
I'll read it again, but remind you that I presume the questioner, and if not the questioner, I would like you to connect it to architecture. It's not really asked theologically. Where is the answer to some possible peace in this life? You have jumped on your fears and have run in all directions. I think it's really another way of asking some of the things we've been talking about all evening.
It
it's
is.
Not
But the presumption is that there has to be an answer. And the answer has to be delivered in the terms that you find satisfying. So the presumption is on the part of the questioner that there has to exist somewhere an answer which would satisfy that question. But nobody said that anywhere. Where does it say that? So there may not be a deliverable answer to a question like that, which means ask another question or come to understand the difficulty of your experience and work with that, which you're categorizing as a fear, but it may not be a fear. It may be what is. It's not a matter of being afraid of it. It's a matter of looking at it straight on and trying to come to terms with it.
Is it fair to say that you see your work more, in fact, as in and of itself asking questions than providing answers?
Well, I think now, and you can see this, for example, with the photographs of the moons of Mars, that you answer questions.
Right.
And you're interested in answering questions. But you know when you answer a question, you raise another problem. Sure. And so for the person who is looking for peace, maybe you spell it Piece, you got a shot. Otherwise, it's don't misunderstand.
I didn't misunderstand anything.
But that the process is both solving and as you solve, you open up something which somebody else is going to have to solve. And it just goes that way, I think. And there may be finally a certain joy in coming to terms with that as the way it is.
Great. Good.
Not necessarily a sort of cheerleader joy, but
Right. That's sort of a resolution, just a sense of
resolution in irresolution.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good. Great. Eric, thank you very much for being. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.